'cause you at war with love. Yeah. Never gone away. Never. Never gonna change. Never. These bad scars. Yeah. Never gone away. Never. They ain't never gonna change. Never. These bad scars don't look like they're fading. Look like they're ever go away. I ain't never gonna change these
Cuando me vine de mi tierra, El Salvador, con intención de llegar a Estados Unidos, sabía que necesitaría más que valor, sabía que a lo mejor quedaba en el camino. Son 3 fronteras las que tuve que cruzar, por 3 países anduve indocumentado, 3 veces tuve yo la vida que arriesgar, por eso dicen que soy 3 veces mojado. En Guatemala y México cuando crucé, 2 veces me salvé, me hicieron prisionero, el mismo idioma y el color reflexioné, ¿cómo es posible que me llamen extranjero?
En Centroamérica, dado su situación tanto política como económicamente, ya para muchos no hay otra solución que abandonar su patria, tal vez para siempre. El mexicano da 2 pasos y aquí está. Hoy lo echan y al siguiente día está de regreso. Eso es un lujo que no me puedo dar sin que me maten o que me lleven preso.
Es lindo México, pero cuánto sufrí. Atravesarlo sin papeles es muy duro. Los 5,000 kilómetros que recorrí, puedo decir que los recuerdo uno por uno. Por Arizona me dijeron cruzará, y que me aviento por en medio del desierto. Por suerte un mexicano al que llamaban Juan me dio la mano, que si no estuviera muerto. Ahora que al fin logré la legalización, lo que sufrí lo he recuperado con creces. A los mojados les dedico mi canción, y a los que igual que yo son mojados 3 veces.
Empacó un par de camisas, un sombrero, su vocación de aventurero, 6 consejos, 7 fotos, 1000 recuerdos. Empacó sus ganas de quedarse, su condición de transformarse en el hombre que soñó y no ha logrado. Dijo adiós con una mueca disfrazada de sonrisa, y le suplicó a su Dios crucificado en la repisa el resguardo de los suyos, y perforó la frontera como pudo. Si la luna suave se desliza por cualquier cornisa sin permiso alguno, porque mojado precisa comprobar con visas que no es de Neptuno. El mojado tiene ganas de secarse. El mojado está mojado por las lágrimas que bota la nostalgia. El mojado, el indocumentado, carga el bulto que legal no cargaría ni obligado.
El suplicio de un papel lo ha convertido en fugitivo.
Y no es de aquí porque su nombre no aparece en los archivos, ni es de allá porque se fue. Si la luna suave se desliza por cualquier cornisa sin permiso alguno, porque el mojado precisa comprobar con visas que no es de Neptuno. Mojado, sabe a mentira tu verdad, sabe a tristeza la ansiedad
De ver un freeway y soñar con la vereda que conduce hasta tu casa.
Mojado, mojado de tanto llorar, sabiendo que en algún lugar espera un beso haciendo pausa desde el día en que te marchaste. Suave se desliza por cualquier cornisa sin permiso alguno, porque el mojado precisa comprobar con visas que no es de Neptuno. Si la visa universal se extiende el día en que nacemos y caduca en la muerte, ¿por qué te persiguen mojado si el cónsul de los cielos ya te dio permiso?
Struggle is my address where pain and crack lives. Gunshots coming from sounds of blackness. Given this game with no time to practice. Born on a blacklist. Told I'm below average. A life with no cabbage. That's no money if you from where I'm from. Funny, I just want some of your son. Dark clouds seem to follow me. Alcohol that my pop swallowed bottle me. No apology, I walk with a bold on my shoulder. It's a cold war, I'm a colder soldier. Hold the same fight that made Martin Luther the king. I ain't using it for the right thing. In between lean and the fiends, hustle and the schemes, I put together pieces of a dream. I still have one.
I got a dream. One day we gonna work it out. One day we gonna work it out. One day we gonna work it out. I have a dream. I got a dream. One day we gonna work it out. One day we gonna work it out. One day we gonna work it out. I have a dream. I got a dream. That one day. That one day. That
to me looking in the mirror. Images of me getting much clearer. Dear self, I wrote a letter just to better my soul. If I don't express it, then forever I hold inside. I'm from a side where we out of control. Rap music and the hood play the fatherly role. My story like yours, yo, gotta be told. Trying to make it from a gangster to a Galia role. Red scrolls of stone slaves and Jewish people in cold cage. Hate has no color or age. Flip the page. Now my race became freedom. Write dreams in the dark, they far, but I can see them. I believe in heaven more than hell. Blessings more than jail. In the ghetto, letting love prevail. With a story to tell. My eyes see the glory and well. The world waiting for me to yell. I have a dream.
I got a dream.
One day,
We gonna work it out, out.
one day,
We gonna work it out, out.
one day.
We gonna work it out.
I have a dream.
I got a dream.
One day,
We gonna work it out, out.
one day,
We gonna work it out, out.
one day.
We gonna work it
I
out.
have a dream
I got a dream
that one day,
that one day I'll look deep within myself. I gotta find a way.
I have a dream.
My dream is to be free. My dream is to be. My dream is to be. My dream is to be free.
AERA Annual Meeting Program Chair.
Good afternoon. We have been planning this meeting for nearly 2 years, and it's wonderful to see you all here to take part in the annual gathering of the AERA Community of Scholars. I'm also happy to greet our colleagues around the world who are joining in by live stream and who will be actively engaging in conference activities through social media, including Twitter, Facebook, and blogs. We're meeting in a historic year for education. We began planning this meeting in 2012, the 150th anniversary of the Morrill Act, which established land-grant universities, which widened access to higher education. 2013 is the sesquicentennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, celebrated here through a spectacular pre-conference symposium. When we gather in 2014, it will be the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, as well as the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act and the 40th anniversary of the Lau versus Nichols case, which happened here in San Francisco and set precedent for educating students with limited English proficiency. We are surrounded by our history. Building on the theme of education and poverty, theory, research, policy, and praxis, we have constructed a program that pushes at definitions of poverty, extending our thinking beyond common conceptions of economic poverty to include moral, intellectual, and aesthetic poverties. The program you have before you, at 460-something pages, is rife, or on your app, is rife with opportunities to consider what creates, maintains, and interrupts conditions of impoverishment, and how education can play a part in ending poverty, or, sadly, sometimes perpetuating the status quo or worse. We take up the challenge laid before us by past President Arnitha Ball and Program Chair Cynthia Tyson, who reminded us last year that to know is not enough. As we open our conference today, I urge you to consider how we must go beyond knowing and about researching poverty to consider how our work contributes to alleviating poverty and eliminating impoverishing conditions in the United States and around the world. Before we begin this opening session, I want to say thank you to an outstanding program committee, to the hundreds of volunteer leaders in the annual meeting planning process, and the over 5,000 reviewers who volunteered to do peer review. This meeting truly could not happen without dedicated volunteers who spend thousands of hours at one of the busiest times of the academic year to review programs and prepare us for the meeting. It also could not happen without the dedication of the AERA professional staff, led by Executive Director Felice Levine, and the meeting staff led by Lori Cipriano. It is not a cliche to say that none of us would be here today if not for their tireless work on behalf of the association. We gather for the next days on the unceded territory of the Ohlone people. I'm pleased to welcome Karina Gould of Indian People Organizing for Change, who comes to us with a greeting.
Horshe Tuge, Ka'at Lashanka, Ka'at Ra'at Karina. And I said, good day. My name is Karina, and I am Chochenyo Ohlone. And I want to welcome you to our territory and tell you a little bit about our history. The Ohlone people are kind of all clumped together as one group now, but there's actually 7 different tribes of us with 7 different languages and 7 different creation stories. And our land base goes all the way from the Carquinez Straits down to Monterey Bay and out to Highway 5, if anybody's interested in looking at a Bay Area map. So we encompass a large area of the Bay Area. My direct ancestors were enslaved at Mission Dolores here in San Francisco and in Mission San Jose in Fremont, California. And so I'm always humbled to be asked to come on behalf of my ancestors to welcome people into our land. And I take that on a bunch of different kinds of levels because when folks first came to this land and they started to enslave us and created these missions where we were colonized and had our languages and our songs and our dances taken away from us at the very beginning, that we didn't come, they didn't come and ask us to welcome them. And so, you know, it humbles me for my ancestors' sake because I stand on behalf of them today. I stand on behalf of those that went before me and those that are coming after me. And so in this lifetime, I really believe that I am the bridge of those two, the past and the future. And so it's really nice that I come to talk to you guys about education because I actually work, my day job is in education, and I am the Title VII coordinator for the Office of Indian Ed in Oakland Unified School District. But my passion work, the work that I've been doing for the last 20 years, the unpaid work is the work of my ancestors and protecting the sacred sites. And so while you sit here today in this wonderful hotel and you're able to see the beautiful views of San Francisco, this was once the land of my ancestors that was lush with green and with water and with many, many thousands of different birds and animals that lived here. And I know that as people that come from different places around the world, we're often sometimes sitting in cities and in schools and in buildings, and we don't recognize the sacredness that is all around us and who we come from. And so what I want to do in welcoming you is to offer a prayer. And now I don't come to people in a way that says that you have to pray with me, but I think if you think of your ancestors and the work that they did in order for you to be in this room today, that you can thank them for that kind of thing, that we could all be humble with coming to a knowledge together and trying to come together with ideas and thoughtfulness in this time that you guys are going to be here working on some very big ideas, and that we open our minds and our hearts and our spirits to the ideas of our colleagues, and that we create something that is worthwhile and better for the future generations. And so in this way, I'm going to just offer a prayer and ask those ancestors the 4 directions that are created for all of us, those different places, to come in and to be with us today, but to be with you guys all while you are in this conference. And as you go home, that you go home safely to your relatives and to your families and to your colleagues. Grandfathers and grandmothers, I ask you today humbly to come here. I ask that you watch over all of these people that have come together in a good way, that we open our minds and our spirits, our ears to each other, and that we create something that is good for our future generations, that we continuously remember our ancestors no matter where they come from, and that they touch us in a way that help us to be better human beings. I ask that you also help us to realize that when we go outside of these doors, that sometimes we look into the sky and realize that we are humble human beings, that we are very small, and we take up a very small space in this universe. I ask that you watch over all of us as we go forward in our lives, and you take us home to our families in a good way, that you help us to take care of and nourish all of those good things that come before us, and you help us to work through our struggles, and that you help us to do the good work that you've intended us to do in this lifetime. Oh, thank you.
We gather this year in the shadow of one of the most violent school-based incidents in U.S. history. In Newtown, Connecticut, 20 children and 6 adults, teachers, administrators, and counselors, were killed on December 12th. We remember them and all victims of violence against youth and educators now with a moment of silence. We remember, too, the AERA members and colleagues who are no longer with us this year. We meet in their memory and take inspiration from them as we press forward in understanding the educational challenges still before us. We will honor their memory and legacy by embracing the call to meaningful engagement with one another this week. I'm pleased now to introduce to you our AERA President, William G. Tierney, who will introduce our plenary speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me echo Chris's welcome and extend my best wishes that we all have a successful meeting. Let me also thank Chris for everything she's done to get us to this point. Now I have the honor to introduce our opening speaker. Many of you know him by his resume. Michael Olivas is the William Bates Distinguished Chair in Law at the University of Houston Law Center and Director of the Institute for Higher Education, Law, and Governance. He holds a BA from the Pontifical College Josephinum, an MA and PhD from Ohio State University, the Ohio State University, and a JD from Georgetown. He is closing in on having published 20 books on an enormous amount of topics. Michael is a polymath. In 2010, he was chosen as the Outstanding Immigration Professor of the Year by the National Immigration Blog Group. In 2011, he served as president of the Association of American Law Schools and has been of enormous counsel to me this year. He has been elected to membership in the American Law Institute and the National Academy of Education. He has served as general counsel to the American Association of University Professors. He also has served as a trustee of the College Board and currently serves as a director of the Maldiff Board. Now, I hope this is all impressive enough for you. Now let me offer a few words about Michael as a friend. We have known one another for a quarter century. When I had more hair and he had less gray, I would send him papers to review, and I learned to set them aside when I received the comments back because they were always bracing. I remember as an assistant professor that an editor of Educational Researcher told me at one point, "I have good news and bad news for you. The good news is that your book will be reviewed in Educational Researcher," certainly something special for an early career faculty member. What could be the bad news? Well, I've asked Michael Olivas to be the reviewer. I survived, but not without a few zingers. Some years later, I was a discussant at a session at a conference, and I recall a graduate student saying, "My advisor told me you were a discussant like Michael Olivas." I said thanks, and then I realized that I wasn't sure if it actually was meant as a compliment. Michael can be tough, but his toughness is always to make our work better and ought not mask a heart as large as the Pecos Wilderness. And then there is a personal side to Michael that some of you may not know. I asked him once what I should say about him at his funeral. Here's what he told me I should say. Michael loved Van Morrison, Aretha, Brenda Lee, and Santana, and most of all, rock and roll, the music and the history and the glorious transformative power of music. Indeed, Michael was really at bottom about the transformative powers that derived from higher education, immigration, and his many years of being married to Tina Reyes. He loved his native New Mexico, the Lensic Theater, the Tecolote Cafe, Amphitheater Rock, and Hatch Chili's. He spoke, he spoke, in English, Spanish, and improbably Latin from having spent 8 years in the seminary. But Michael was struck mute in an elevator alone with Julie Andrews, whom he adored. The one thing that I cannot believe about Michael is that he was ever struck mute. Michael Olivas.
God, I wish Julie were here. I'm sitting today because I'm having replacement surgery. But all of you be reassured that I'm taking it like a man, which is badly, with a lot of whining and crying. I wish I had remembered that there was medical marijuana use in. What was it? What did I do? Oh, I thought it was mine. Yeah, we could. Yeah, that was a great line too. Did it fall down? You start out with medical marijuana, then it leads to the hard stuff, and pretty soon no one can hear you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Let me just say what passes for medical marijuana out here is felony weight in Texas. So I want to thank Bill and Chris and the many others, Felice. It truly takes a village for an occasion such as this. And to walk in and have Richie Havens playing, the late beloved Richie Havens, who just passed this week, is truly meaningful to me. My friend from New Mexico, Leo Martinez, the current president of ALS, is here in the audience, as is a seminary classmate of mine, Paul Sarbaugh, one of the smartest guys I've ever known. We both attended the Pontifical College Josephinum, and it turned out that after 8 years we both left. Turns out we were much better at afflicting the comfortable than we ever were at comforting the afflicted. Tomorrow at 6:15, in what is hidden as the Law and Education SIG business meeting, one of my favorite lawyers in the world, Peter Roos, who argued Plyler versus Doe, is going to be there. And I urge you at 6:15, if you have nothing better to do, come to the Taylor Room. Let's oversubscribe that room just like we're doing here today. Peter Roos. And of course, as if anyone needs reminding, all men marry way above their heads, and I am certainly the case there, case number one. So I dedicate this talk to my wife, Tina Reyes, Professor Reyes. I'm so very pleased to have this opportunity. When Bill originally asked me what topic I would like to speak on, I said, well, can't we just play rock and roll? Can't we just play Aretha the whole time? And everybody will leave saying, God, Michael was really great. He introduced Aretha, who just had her 70th birthday, by the way. Her 72nd birthday, actually. But Dreams Deferred, to those of you who have ever read Langston Hughes, it's not actually Langston Hughes to whom I pay tribute here. It's actually John Lennon, because of his wonderful songs about dreams, but also because the famous case that I'm going to talk about today, one of the cases, involves John Lennon. It's the U.S. versus John Lennon, and it's a case about which there was a documentary, and it's a case about deferred action, which has loomed so large in the lives of many of the undocumented students. I've already had 6 Dreamers or DACA students come up to me today and introduce themselves and thank me for acts over the years on their behalf. I actually would like to thank them for the great courage and political action that they've shown. Here's my thesis, and it won't always be clear what my... There's anybody who's listened to me give a long talk, which is a shrinking number of people, I gotta say, will know it's not always clear what my thesis is, but let me just straightforwardly say that at a time of unprecedented nativism and restrictionism and largely anti-Mexican rhetoric in the United States, that's demonstrable and is dangerous and is felt, especially in states such as California, where there frankly are just so many Mexicans. There is a counterwind, a countervailing undercurrent, an undertow of great accommodation and invitation, and I don't mean just by our actions that lead to many people coming here, because after all, they don't just sort of show up unbid. We invite them here. We hire them to do the work and that we don't want to do, that we don't want our kids to do, and then we somehow realize that they brought families with them. So we recruit workers, and they brought families. We have 15 states that give in-state tuition. I don't know if I haven't checked Colorado whether or not the governor signed the bill, but he's got a bill on his desk, and in the next couple of days he'll be signing it, in which case 15 states will have accorded in-state tuition. 3 states will give in-state financial aid to undocumented students. We now have 500,000 students working their way through deferred action for childhood arrivals. They can now get Social Security numbers, and they can work, and they can no longer have unlawful status. They can leave the country and come back. They haven't been able to transform themselves in the immigration system, but that's just simply a matter of time. The adults have finally taken over, and that's going to occur certainly within a semester or so with comprehensive immigration reform. Even so, we have states who carelessly enact laws or practices that continue to hurt these students. We have citizen children, birthright citizen children in New Jersey and Florida who, because their parents are undocumented, are ineligible for in-state tuition or financial aid until the courts come along and groups such as the ACLU or Southern Poverty Law Center or MALDEF, the group with which I work, or NILC, the National Immigration Lawyer Center, come along to sue them and correct the record. Were precluded from receiving benefits, citizen children, simply because of the status of their parents, a matter that had been settled in the 1800s. Moreover, in this state and in Florida, we have undocumented lawyers now surfacing, persons who have passed the bar, who do not have legal status in the United States, and both bar associations have actually recommended that they be admitted to practice. I know I'm not, that a line of increasing the number of lawyers is not going to get any sympathy for anybody in this room, but let me just tell you, at AALS, that line would kill. Now, there's an entire legal literature devoted to the topic of nativism and anti-immigrant sentiment. And immigration has always been a very complex transaction and certainly a dangerous sojourn for the children. And local forces have attempted to control the process, especially as the country was forming and borders were not yet fully established. But throughout our history, state and local politicians have introduced and enacted hundreds of anti-alien bills. Some legislation has even been so mean-spirited as to advocate a repealing of Plyler versus Doe, the 1982 case that we celebrated last year on its 30th anniversary, which would have allowed states to charge tuition to undocumented school children or citizen children, again, whose parents were undocumented. In difficult economic times, elected officials find that scapegoating aliens is easy to reach the low-hanging fruit, as if these workers were the source of the sputtering economy instead of the saviors, so that in Hazleton, where no one, citizen or otherwise, would pick mushrooms, Mexicans, of course, came there, and so one of the very first local restrictionist laws, local laws, was passed, until it was later largely overturned by the Supreme Court. For example, Alabama enacted House Bill 56, the Alabama Taxpayer and Citizen Protection Act, something that you just know is wrong. It's like being named the Patriot Act. You just know that if you're required to salute it in order to pass it, that it's wrong. Regarded as the most draconian anti-immigrant legislation to date, its statement of purpose is emblematic of nativist and anti-immigrant politicians turning undocumented immigrants into scapegoats during difficult economic times. And of course, one can sympathize, because after all, Alabama shares a gulf with Mexico. shares a, is this still dead? By the way, Bill, all those pictures flashing at me earlier, did you stalk me for a while? I mean, honestly, I don't even know where some of that stuff came from. And I'm not even on Twitter or the other social media. It's a good thing. Here was the enactment language. The state of Alabama finds that illegal immigration is causing economic hardship and lawlessness in this state. After all, they share the Gulf. And that illegal immigration is encouraged when public agencies within this state provide public benefits without verifying immigration status. You know, all 200 of the Mexicans who came. Because the costs incurred by school districts for the public elementary and secondary education of children who are aliens not lawfully present can adversely affect the availability of public resources to students who are United States citizens or who are aliens lawfully present. Just to get that on the record, the state of Alabama determines that there's a compelling need for the State Board of Education to accurately measure and assess the population of students who are aliens not lawfully present in order to forecast and plan for any impact that the presence such population may have on this state. Well, this is why we have courts, and the courts struck it down, and thankfully, after the 11th Circuit confirmed that decision, they decided not to go to the Supreme Court on this. A direct threat on Plyler versus Doe, one that hasn't really surfaced in most other states, and one of the first in many years. All of these arguments and legislation mixed in a cauldron amidst shrill warnings about the rights of real Americans lead inevitably to a sense of divisiveness, of racial superiority, and undifferentiated prejudice. Such imprecise and undifferentiated and broad brush swipes at illegals and aliens and anchor babies generally tar all these groups. This kind of free-floating racialized animus often leads to generalized resentment against all people of color or others. How many of you in the room, I will tell you at an immigration conference, I would get a different result in all likelihood, secretly feared when you heard about the bombing, could this have been people from another country? And it turns out, tragically, that it was. These sentiments ignore government studies showing that immigrants, however defined, are net economic contributors and will be more so after their incorporation through comprehensive immigration reform. Some decry the detrimental effects of immigration. They claim that criminals are not deterred from entering or remaining in the country. Serious candidates for president claim that Pakistanis are hiding and crossing the border because they look like Mexicans and therefore would be able to enter undeterred. Another seriously says that not only do we need more of a fence, but we need it to be electrified. And these are people who, for a time at least, were serious candidates. Well, they were candidates, let's put it that way. And as you saw, Governor Perry of Texas, who signed the very first pro-tuition bill, was excoriated from it and largely run from the campaign because of it. As I said afterwards, even a stopwatch is right once a day, because he made up for that courageous act, frankly quite courageous, by offering to send in the Texas National Guard into Mexico the week after. So I took back all the good things that I ever said about him. These restrictionists claim that immigrants take jobs and services from citizens, that they undercut or depress wages, even as most restrictionists have voted against minimum wage laws for years. They assert that immigrants are going to remain stubbornly monolingual in languages other than English. But let me just say that the biggest problem we have is language loss in the second generation of Mexican and other Latino kids who come to the United States who have English force-fed, but who worse, lose the native language and their ability to communicate with their parents and their grandparents. This is no Quebecois the rush to learn English is overwhelming and inculcative and a natural progression. The big problem, of course, is we need more people who frankly speak Spanish. They also assert that immigrants don't understand the American character and that their unlawful presence is itself a sign of an unwillingness to abide by the rules, forgetting the sojourner nature of how these children arrived here. Of course, these traits, to the extent that they're accurate, do describe some immigrants in legal status or in documented status just as surely as they describe some natives. All we have to do is remember Timothy McVeigh and the tragedy that he befell upon us. However, if there were a group that holds promise to become productive college students, particularly the undocumented, it would surely be that group. With the generally dismal schooling available to these students, that even a small percentage of them can meet the admission standards of the University of California or of other colleges and universities is itself extraordinary. Given their status and struggle, each successful student represents a story of substantial accomplishment. Most of the sociological observations of these students are ones that square with my own, including a number of students and faculty here in this room who I know have studied both the undocumented as well as DACA students over the years. While I don't want to be or seem reductionist or to generalize beyond recognition, it's been my experience that most of these undocumented students are high-achieving strivers, virtually indistinguishable from their classmates until they try and get a driver's license. They have a resilience and a persistence held by few native citizens who are born at an advantage relative to these students. Most of these students have parents who struggle to bring them to this country and who exercise considerable risk and danger to enable the achievements of their children. That they succeed under these extraordinary circumstances is remarkable to virtually all who observe them. Their success partially explains why so many educators and legislators have accepted Plyler and worked to assist them in navigating the complexities of school and college. That's why we have the 15 states, some of them quite improbable, who have enacted state laws to assist these students in an accommodationist feature. Despite all the successes of anti-immigrant rhetoric in shaping a discourse and of restrictionists in fashioning the resentments, reasonable legislators of both parties have attempted to address these issues that students face, notwithstanding the inevitable political blowback. This underlying support to remedy the failures of national immigration policy is a much better barometer of the country's generosity and acceptance of this shadow population than are even the bleedings of the Lou Dobbs or the Chris Kobaches of this world. Plyler provides a wonderful example of private citizens' efforts to remedy the failures of national immigration policy, and its backstory shows just how tenuous the Plyler decision was in the first place. Without the generosity and persistence of Peter Roos, who you'll meet tomorrow, and the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, and others who litigated this matter, this case would never have gotten to the U.S. Supreme Court. Absent the powerful backstory of Texans precluding innocent children from attending public school, the court would likely not have overturned the law. Scholars who've looked carefully and thoughtfully at the case have determined it to be sui generis, not so much limited to its facts, but as possessing weak doctrinal force and little constitutional significance. Its gravitational pull has not affected many subsequent cases, as none has really come before the court since then on all fours. Gracias a Dios. The political events since 1982 have not led to serious challenges on the legislative front, even as Plyler has always been vulnerable, because Plyler held that a state may not charge tuition, but it says nothing about whether or not the federal government may do so. And in the 1990s, a serious proposal by Representative Gallegly was the one serious attempt to preempt Plyler's holding at the federal level. He led an unsuccessful attempt in 1996 to ban undocumented children from public schools, but his proposal was so polarizing it didn't even take root or result in active legislation. Nonetheless, it had its effect of fragging the system and led to some of the most mean-spirited restrictions legislation we've had, the so-called AERA, and PWORA, which stand for in 1996. For those of you who are taking notes, such efforts have not surfaced in a serious vein since that time, and no serious state actions have threatened undocumented students' educational access in the nearly 2 decades since LULAC v. Wilson successfully repealed Proposition 187 here in California. However, restrictionist attempts have recently occurred, such as in a case called HICA versus Alabama, where in order to try and keep the undocumented out of Alabama schools, because after all, Alabama also shares a Gulf with Mexico, they decided that no SCOTUS appeal after losing at the 11th Circuit. They had drafted so badly that even refugees couldn't attend public institutions in the state of Alabama. In other words, the attempt to squeeze out the undocumented was drafted so badly that the law was actually struck down. So they redid the law, and now the undocumented cannot attend in that state. Fair enough. I believe that if a state wants to keep them out, they may do so, but the reverse is also true, that if a state wishes to admit them, then they must do so. And after 8 different attempts that restrictionists have taken at the various state statutes, at the end of the day, not one has ever been struck down. And so the balance, again, with my thesis being that notwithstanding the evidence that there is considerable anti-immigrant and restrictionist sentiment in the land, that there are still enormous acts of generosity at the state and local level. In the state of Texas, only one city, Farmers Branch, not really even technically a city, it's like a suburb, is the only group that's ever passed anti-immigrant legislation, notwithstanding the fact that Texas really does have skin in this game with the country's largest border with Mexico. Now, notwithstanding Plyler's continued validity in cases like Martinez versus Regents, which upheld AB 540, and LULAC v. Wilson, which rejected attempts to limit the undocumented students' access to schools, scholars have chronicled the many permutations that have arisen in lower federal and state courts. So immigrant advocates have to relitigate and shore up the number of corollary and subsidiary issues that flow from the touchstone Plyler case. On the whole, we've been able to beat back most of the secondary, direct, and diagonal threats, such as policies affecting immigrant youth. And indeed, the record shows wide and deep accommodation to these children at individual school and district and state levels, even as federal and state efforts to enact stricter employment legislation of their parents have increased. So that the record includes the broad range of post-secondary Plyler issues, where most of the states with larger numbers of undocumented school children, and some even with fewer such students, have facilitated their enrollments in public colleges and universities. Even as states have ratcheted up their efforts to apprehend undocumented parents and unauthorized workers through E-Verify and other imperfect means, many other states have carved out and maintained safe havens for the undocumented school children. As but just one example, Utah, not thought of as a particularly hospitable climate to immigrants, retained its post-secondary residency tuition status for undocumented college students, even as it moved to enact significant restrictionist employment and benefit legislation. Several states have enacted harsh measures against these college students, such as South Carolina, which banned them in 2009, and others, Missouri and Arizona, which have not accorded them in-state residency. But most major receiver states have extended residency status to undocumented college students, as have unusual venues from Nebraska to Kansas to Utah. If Florida were to ever move in this direction, all of the major immigrant states, receiver states, save Arizona, would allow undocumented students to enroll and receive resident tuition status. These are surely markers of how deeply the roots of Plyler have reached into the country's soil and been accepted. The truth is, the United States needs this talent pool, as half the sessions I've seen revolve around STEM and our other needs in that area. In highly technical fields, foreign scholars enroll in high numbers, and after consuming the benefits of our educational system, often return to their own countries. This is as it should be, as learning respects no borders, and recruiting internationally surely enriches all of our campuses, and I know that there are a number of international scholars here, and I, for one, welcome you here. However, the undocumented have every incentive to remain in the United States, to adjust their status through formal or discretionary means, and to contribute to the U.S. economy and the polity. Each year, for the last 4 years, we have removed almost 400,000 persons a year. It turns out that the Democrats are really good at border enforcement. Who knew? Notwithstanding that, the number of persons who are removed, tens of thousands of U.S. citizen children every year are removed, who can represent their credentials when they're 18, or, as Governor Romney said, they can self-deport. My own experiences over the years with these students have showed them to be extremely, deeply loyal to the United States. They've never known another country. In most instances, have never spoken a language other than English. Despite their undocumented status, most are more Americanized than our many native-born students. They believe in the immigrant success story, having lived it in most instances. In fact, they believe in the civil rights struggle so much that they have conducted sit-ins, they've outed themselves, they have shouted down, they have brought attention. They want to be like Martin Luther King in Birmingham jail, writing the letters from Birmingham jail. Congratulations to them for DACA and for getting our attention in so many successful ways, and showing us how important it is to use the resources of being in the United States. Those of us born here often forget just how extraordinary a society this is. It takes dreamers and the undocumented to remind us of the sojourner stories. Now today, immigrant restrictionists have resorted to false stories and scapegoating in their campaign to vilify immigrants. My friend Dean Kevin Johnson at UC Davis, with a long history of thoughtful immigration scholarship, labels this phenomenon of waging metaphorical wars as the hijacking of the debate over immigration reform by monsters, ghosts, and goblins, or the war on drugs, the war on terror, or the war on narco-terrorists. Despite all of the data showing negligible undocumented participation in the country's vast higher education system, immigration opponents have told tales of massive displacement and lawlessness. Remember the language for Alabama, voicing concern for those lawfully in the country. They've told tales of massive displacement and lawlessness, and neither of these tales is true. Unbalanced, immigrants, whether lawfully admitted or undocumented, are present and future contributors. Our society benefits tremendously by their stories and their loyalties. And precluding their incorporation into the community through higher education is a foolishly short-sighted policy. Those who actively oppose the integration of long-term undocumented elementary and college students should be ashamed of themselves for their actions. Important public policy should not be premised upon unsubstantiated tales and hateful rhetoric, such as those documented by Dean Johnson and others in this room. I see Will Pettis and others who have done this work for years. When I consider the hydraulics of immigration, particularly the tug between federal and state jurisdiction and enforcement, the likely downsides of the nativist proposals, and the rise of local and state immigration-related proposals, I'm convinced that no good can come from these sub-federal assumptions of immigration powers. To be sure, some of the inefficiencies in the current system are incontestably dysfunctional, though the dysfunctionality largely is absorbed by the immigrants themselves. The result of increased overlap in decentralized immigration enforcement, which would introduce new span of control problems and complexities of coordination, would in all likelihood, if not equally would be more dysfunctional. More importantly, the sub-federal assumption of federal immigration powers would not appreciably improve the current system, which already has coordinating provisions built in, even if they're not widely adopted. If state legislators think that the existing system is broken, the checkerboard of different enforcement regimes is likely to be even more complex. 50 different and inconsistent state schemes are no better approach than a single improved federal scheme, like OJ driving his white SUV across different police jurisdictions. Imagine that at the immigration regime level. Now, the blowback in affected communities and increased prejudice are sure to follow from sub-federal assumption of immigration powers. Local enforcement efforts have necessitated that landlords check the immigration status of renters. That in Alabama, that they census the children because we want to provide better services. All of these are sure signs of a racial, ethnic, and national origin tax that will only be levied upon certain groups, certain to be Mexicans in particular, or equally likely, Mexican Americans. Think of poor Marcelo Lucero, an Ecuadorian permanent resident living legally in the United States and Long Island, who, because he looks Mexican, is beaten to death by thugs who call him a beaner. They were out beaner hunting on a Saturday night. Beaner hunting on a Saturday night. Anti-immigrant sentiment, in my view, is largely an anti-Mexican phenomenon. We're not concerned about undocumented Swedes coming to the United States with their lutefisk and ABBA. Speaking of ABBA, can you imagine that they are elected to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? And Yusuf Islam, Cat Stevens, is not? That is what this group of smart people ought to devote themselves to, is ridding the world of these gross inequities that are occurring in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. These more than petty nuisances are reminiscent of our inglorious immigration history of racial exclusion, and they are pigtail ordinances in modern guise. A line I have wanted to use in San Francisco, which had the original pigtail ordinances for many years. Despite their surface attractiveness and the thin veneer, we should resist these as fixes. Given the 30-plus intervening years since Plyler, it's difficult to reimagine or recreate the time and place of pre-1980s, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, as the high water mark of the liberal polity, despite the fact that it was signed by that famous liberal, former California governor and President Ronald Reagan. IRCA allowed the children from Plyler versus Doe to become citizens, as they did. Reading the record of the case, one missing feature then is the highly polarized debate and interest group mobilization seen today. While the issue of undocumented children in the 1970s was hardly under the radar, it did not draw the sting of restrictionists or the attention of progressive ethnic partisans that have arisen since that time. As unimaginable a breach by a congressman heckling the president about immigrant health care in a televised congressional session, you lie. Remember, his shout out was about whether or not the undocumented would be able to be included in health care. It was simply unfathomable in 1982 through 1986 when IRCA was actually enacted. Despite the intermittent restrictionist impulses in the United States polity, there has been wide and deep acceptance of these children in the nation's schools. I know that there are people in the room today who benefited from those. I have a student in my class right now who's the beneficiary of deferred action for childhood arrivals. I have had 4 undocumented research assistants over the years, 2 of whom have aged out for DACA, but comprehensive immigration reform will likely sweep them into the net and move them to the front of the line because they can prove that they were in the United States. Many, although not all, of the thousands of school districts and states have accommodated their enrollments, facilitated their schooling, celebrated their achievements, and extended them college acceptance and resources. The one serious federal challenge, the Gallagher Amendment, failed to gain any traction. Other contemporary legislative efforts have attempted to provide additional rights to immigrant children. So the DREAM Act, unsuccessfully introduced in 2001 by Orrin Hatch and recently reintroduced but failed, may ultimately provide a means, although I think that comprehensive immigration reform is going to settle this issue once and for all. And these children will be citizens sooner than later. The Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals has given faith and opportunity for over 500,000 applicants so far. Virtually none have been refused. In fact, it has been so successful that it has been challenged in federal court and is likely next week to be struck down in federal court, although there'll be a long time, and I think that it will actually become overtaken by the events of comprehensive immigration reform. Paradoxically, Plyler's wide-scale acceptance, none of which would have been possible without these kids having achieved in school, has occurred in the context of unprecedented nativism and restrictionism, and in the face, frankly, of unmatched concerns about national security and terrorism. Unauthorized immigrant employment-related legislation and immigration enforcement are much more salient today than they were in the 1980s. IRCA, after all, made the hiring of unauthorized workers illegal for the first time. Prior to that time, the entire onus of enforcement was upon the immigrant, not upon the employer. And therefore, today, much of today's attention is on rooting out the core reason for the undocumented workers who come to our factories and our homes and our workplaces. The fact that they have children, including U.S. citizen children, is less the dominant focus than the original sins of the parents following the siren call of work. Plyler was always a close call. The decision was 5-4. It was surprising inasmuch as it had followed the hapless experience of Rodriguez. Plyler never commanded widespread constitutional attention or gained the weight accorded other doctrinal developments. It's widely understood to be one of a kind, perhaps high moral ground, iconic but limited in its application. Plyler continued a developing line of residency cases reaching back to Graham versus Richardson, prohibiting the states and Congress from using broad, unvariegated brushstrokes that didn't distinguish among the many categories of people. Just as today, Governor Brewer in Arizona is in court because MALDEF and NILC and others have sued her because she said, we accept deferred action, which would allow these kids to get driver's licenses, but we don't think that deferred action that DACA is deferred action. As if governors get the opportunity to make these differentiations. She's so busy chasing headless bodies in the desert in Arizona that she has been confused and gotten bad legal advice. I recognize my colleague Tanya Broder here from NILC, who is one of the leading experts on these benefits. In this sense, all aliens within the border of the country, no matter their legal status, are eligible for certain constitutional protection. Although Rodriguez held that education was not a fundamental right, and that Plyler explicitly rejected the argument that these immigrant children are a suspect class, nonetheless, Justice Brennan said that the law must survive more than a rational basis to survive. That the Texas statute at issue in Plyler singled out these children, innocents, even if their parents had dirty hands, convinced the lower courts and Justice Brennan all the more that Texas could not even satisfy the most deferential level of constitutional scrutiny. Now, in earlier works of mine, I have available in fine bookstores everywhere, soon to be major motion pictures, starring Jimmy Smits as me, because of the eerie resemblance, don't you agree? I've reviewed the various legal strands of Plyler and suggested why I thought that the preemption doctrine would have been a more useful doctrine than that of equal protection, especially today when anti-immigrant policies are spreading at the state and local level, and where restrictionist statutes are beginning to make their way to the U.S. Supreme Court as they did in Arizona. To turn back the only Texas local anti-immigrant ordinance in Farmers Branch, MALDEF had to secure 3 TROs and eventually won a permanent injunction, making us sort of the Dutch boy legal defense fund, I figured, requiring fingers in far too many local and state dikes. To undertake and finance all the litigation required of us in Arizona, we had to close our Atlanta office despite the many incidents of discrimination against Latinos in the southeastern United States. Make no mistake, we will win these cases. It's like wildcatting back in Texas, where you win and you bet the whole enterprise on it, and then later, when you strike oil, you win. We will win these cases. Nonetheless, it would be so much better if these cases didn't exist. So what can educators do? Well, I'm here to listen and to learn these issues from you. I would say at the very minimum, you need to monitor your school's compliance. After all, sometimes schools, in an attempt to highlight safety, will say, well, all you have to do is present a driver's license. Well, most of the undocumented, in fact, the undocumented in all but 2 states, my home state of New Mexico and Washington State, don't allow the undocumented to get driver's licenses. Understand that these kids are ours. They're not returning. They're not going to self-deport. I don't care what Governor Romney has urged. It's not in their interest, and it's not in our interest that they do so. We've had them here consuming the benefit. Now it is time to put that to use. It makes no sense to repatriate them to whatever the home country was. Not only are they no longer of that country, they are ours. We have invested in them, and it's time for us to harvest that investment. They are our seed corn. So the communitarian seeds of Plyler may not have rooted in the sterile, nativistic, and restrictionist soil, and it may be difficult for immigration activists and defenders to remain vigilant when these threats do occur. Sometimes they occur in ways that's so hard to find. Who was monitoring Alabama and their ability to enroll refugees? Well, we were. Someone has to look out for these interests for the larger polity. Now, these threats are either the direct Gallagher-like federal threats or the more focused Proposition 187 form, or the 2011 Alabama approach, or even the more oblique practices like I've mentioned, such as heightened attendance zones or driver's licenses, or the use of Social Security numbers as identification numbers when that's not what they're used for. In fact, if you read a Social Security card, it says not to be used for identification purposes. I prefer to cast my lot with the more generous impulses of communitarian traits in the American character, trusting and verifying the challenges and recognizing the long view. However they arrived here, most of these children are our newest family members, and we ignore this truth at our peril. For this reason, if for no other, Plyler versus Doe should be celebrated and noted as a salutary event it surely is. Thank you all so very much for your attention and for the opportunity to tell you what I thought about this. would be very pleased in the time remaining to take a few questions. Chris, if you would call on people and monitor. How much time do we have?
We have about 12 minutes for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll get
This often happens where I answer everybody's questions in the room.
No, they're still wondering when you're going to break out in Dancing Queen.
Yeah. You're going to have to pay more than that to see it. By the way, if you're going to have knee surgery, go on YouTube and look at it. It's not surgery, it's carpentry.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Diana Salas. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I'm actually focusing my dissertation on this question of state right, the state immigration policies that are emerging in the last 12 years. But you seem very enthusiastic about comprehensive immigration reform being this possibility. And we sort of saw this momentum 10 years ago, and then 9/11 happened. And being that I'm now in Boston, the bombing happened. And I feel like that casts immigration reform back again in this national security frame and less so on the discourse around integration of migrants and particularly the youth. So, what are you privy to that you're kind of excited about this possibility about comprehensive immigration reform? And I'm sort of looking at this as a new fight as we did 10 years ago.
I think it's the meds mostly. Well, we've had this issue of terrorism, including undocumented terrorists who were on those planes, and so we've survived that. It's been built into the system, and I think it's already played itself out in SEVIS and many of the other kinds of features that have arisen since that time. And I don't think that confused Chechenian kids are going to derail it this time. I believe it because I have to, and because there's going to be an election, and the Republicans are coming to this because they know that they lost badly, and so I think that the corner has been turned, in my view, and I think that there's both God and the details are buried deep. Both God and the devil are buried in the details of comprehensive immigration reform. So I'm not certain it's going to be perfect, but I'm confident that DACA will survive, and that alone gives me hope, because once these kids thread the needle and become lawyers and doctors and teachers and so forth, as they're now eligible to be, I think that all the reasons that state-level activities occurred, that is, the successes of these children, the sojourner backstory, the basic resonance with their parents may have sinned, but they didn't, and they're here now, we ought to make the best of it. I think all of them, and frankly, how else to explain Orrin Hatch introducing the DREAM Act? Honestly, that normally would be enough for me to oppose it, frankly. And when it came time, he walked and didn't vote for it. So it requires a lot of pieces, but I'm confident it's going to happen, and I have to believe that. I just at 62, born a U.S. citizen, birthright citizen of two citizen parents, I just can't continue to devote my life to something that would be so unlikely. I just feel that all the pieces are in place. And it's mostly due, frankly, to these kids achieving and not turning out to be Chechenian kids. If that's in fact how this turns out, that's not the kids we're talking about. These kids are, for the most part, indistinguishable, and they're your friends, and you've had them sleep over at your house, and we don't want them to go back to Mexico or wherever else they came from. So I just have to believe it. And I think we're pretty far committed to it. Nothing's going to derail it this time. Yeah.
Tracy Williams from Seattle Pacific University. I was recently down at High Tech High School in San Diego and had a terrific experience in what they call a slice experience for deeper learning. Spent the day with Enrique Morones and the Border Angels. We walked down to Friendship Park on the border. We were under constant surveillance on this side of the border. I've never really felt so much like George Orwell was really right in my life as on that day, when we were really on our side of the border doing what U.S. citizens might do, which I wouldn't recommend, by the way, on your way to a knee replacement surgery.
Yeah,
not a good idea. What kinds of experiences would you recommend for really immersing educators and our students into immigration issues in a thoughtful way that helps us kind of get to the guts of this?
At this point, I would say simply teach them like you would all of our children. There's nothing else that we can really do right now other than advocacy in whatever format that takes, whether it's in a business club or through your alumni association or whatever means you involve yourself in the electoral polity to let it be known. I think that the work has been done. When you have an 800-page draft, the question is, how do we cut the damn thing down and get rid of the really poisonous stuff in there? But we have turned that corner. We didn't have that earlier in answer to we hadn't gotten to that point. It's ripened, and so now the question is, how do we do it? As for our daily work, I think that we simply have to involve more of the parents. I think that these parents have never had occasion to come out of the shadows. And one of I sort of am embarrassed by this, but early on I wrote and advocated that we wait and see how DACA turns out, because you're giving all your information to the government, including where your parents live, and with no guarantee that you're going to get employment or anything else back that was any better. And then it turns out that they all get employment authorization, all get Social Security numbers. Who knew? I should have known. It's just that the one-year Morton experiment that went on was so bad and so poorly orchestrated and so unsuccessful that I had no reason to believe that in 90 days they would come up with a truly great transformative program. They did. I think we have to let that work. If you have kids now who are waiting, don't hesitate. Go while it's legal. The program hasn't been struck down. Go forward, because these kids get to the front of the line in immigration reform. They're going to become 5-year citizens, not 13-year citizens like their parents will be. Urge them to seek legal assistance if they have a DWI or some other hit on their record. Some of them have been holding back. But we've been doing over 3,000 a day. This is a truly remarkable federal program. We don't do that many Pell Grants anymore per day. We don't fully fund it. That was a joke. We really, right now, we just need to treat these kids like they're our own, like we would any other kids. I don't think special efforts need to be undertaken. I think special efforts need to be undertaken for their parents. And if you live in a state that doesn't yet have a in-state tuition, I think that there are activities that need to be undertaken, because I think that deferred action will give students in-state tuition, even in states that haven't passed such bills. The ironic thing is, we've always, in many states, have had deferred action on the books for years. In Texas, you could get a driver's license with deferred action. It's just that nobody ever got it because you couldn't apply for it. It was the last refuge in a humanitarian concern. So we let people get driver's licenses with deferred action. So in Texas, even though Governor Bush said, we're not going to give driver's license, he had no choice because the law on the books already gave it to them. This is what's so truly transformative and comprehensive about DACA, and so we ought to be pushing more. They said that 1.7 million kids were eligible. I think that's a high number, especially when you start pulling out all the DWIs of Aggies and Longhorns and pull them out. I thought a MIP was a minor in philosophy. I was always very impressed that all these kids had advanced degrees. Turns out it's minors in possession, which may render them ineligible. But I still think a substantial number of these kids need to come forward and get registered and get DACAized. There's that little kid from San Luis Obispo who took out a YouTube. Shame on him, saying, this is too invasive. If he thinks that DACA is invasive, wait until he sees what deportation does to him and what immigration becoming naturalized would do to him. No. That's false advice. Whoever's given it to you, I don't care how good their Chicano credentials are, that's wrong. But the truth is, we need to get more of these kids in there and signed up for DACA. That's got to be our priority right now, in my view.
Hello, my name is Estefania Lopez, and I'm an undergraduate from the University of California, Irvine. My question deals with the rhetoric involving undocumented students' parents. I believe that the rhetoric surrounding undocumented students has generally turned positive. Instead of saying that these students are receiving undue benefits, that they are deserving of these benefits because they've proven themselves to be worthy of it. However, the rhetoric for the parents are that undocumented students are not responsible for the sins of their parents. However, I do believe that undocumented parents are oftentimes economic refugees resulting from U.S. neoliberal policies. So I wanted to know what your opinion was on these statements that state that undocumented parents are responsible, that they broke the law, that they're committing sins, and that undocumented students are not responsible for that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and it's easy to be really facile about this because if you're going to have an innocent sojourner's narrative, it requires crime breakers. It's built into the story. And I certainly concur, and I think comprehensive immigration reform, depending on exactly how far back it goes, that's part of the question, will render a number of them in lawful status, and then their efforts will have borne fruit. The fact that their children can do so well has borne fruit. But simply our proclaiming them economic refugees doesn't make them economic refugees. There is no provision in U.S. refugee law for economic refugees. That's why Cubans come, but Haitians don't. Our saying so doesn't create whole cloth refugee or asylum features for them. So part of it is a spin-off of the narrative, but I think that they're certainly hardworking. My advice was always, don't do anything that's going to put your parents at risk because they are deportable. And the truth is, we're deporting 400,000 people a year. Those are people who don't have permission to be in the United States. And so this is not sort of mere rhetoric. This is people who get apprehended, usually at the workplace, or because they get outed. And I didn't want the children who are the beneficiaries of DACA and other features to out their parents because so many of them live with their parents. But that doesn't mean vilifying the parents. All of us, even citizen, I think the point is well taken. I think that the rhetoric does not need to pile on, and I don't think that it's necessary to have I think that you can have a nuanced rhetoric about sojourner children without vilifying the parents. But I do think that there are going to be separate pathways, and you have to be at least 21 and a citizen to bring anyone here. That's the ugliness about anchor babies, as if these children arrange to be born here so that 21 years from now they can regularize their mothers who, after 18 years hence, can become citizens. This notion of the multiplication, the arithmetic of that is just absurd. It doesn't work that way. So I think that people who know better shouldn't use that rhetoric, and I think that you have to be very careful about apportioning blame. I think these parents are to be commended, but I think that it's much more evident that these are our children than it is under law that these are our parents. I just think that's the nature of immigration struggle, and I think that we can't keep counting on every 25 years there being a legalization that will sweep up all the people. We have to make it easier for people to come here. If I'm a permanent resident and my wife is Mexican and I want to bring her here under second preference, there's an 8-year wait right now. If I'm a Filipino and I want to bring a brother here who's in line, it can take 17 years. The problem isn't undocumented immigration, the problem is legal immigration. These people have no place because we have these 20,000 per country limitations. So you can bring all the Swedes you want with their, there are many countries that we just don't use up the numbers, but Mexicans in particular, and Dominicans, and Chinese, and Indians and Filipinos are in these long waits because of the malfunction of our legal immigrant system. Your point is a good one, though, and I should be as aware as anybody of that. One more question?
Actually, I'm afraid that was the last question for now. Although we know that Michael can't move very fast, so you can probably catch him and ask. Sorry.
I'm taking it like a man.
I want to thank all of you for joining us for opening session, and particularly to thank again Dr. Hernandez.
Thank you.
And I want to invite everybody to join us at an opening reception, which is in this hotel in the lobby level in the Golden Gate rooms 3 through 8, so down some set of escalators.
All over the world.